So I'd really like this also to be like a dialogue, that it's not, some kind of a monologue from my side, but it is something that we are trying also to seek a way of understanding from a broader perspective, from different cultural orientations, from different environments, from different modes of thinking. So it's not just me saying what art is about, but let's also find a platform where we can all share and have a conversation about what art means in the field of education. What can it bring uh, to a process of um, a way of understanding the world around us? Yeah. So I'm just I would like if anybody would like to say something, and then I would like to pick up on that.
So we've received one statement made by Purti Doshi. She says it as in art. Art is a way that children can express themselves. And also what we have observed is that it helps them calm down.
That is something that I think is important in the way that arts in general has actually given the child an opportunity, I would say, to find an expression of their own, and it's not always something which is given, by an adult, but what we mean by art is something which comes, from the learner. So I think that's an important distinction that we can hold on to, because that, I think, also shapes the way in which we could understand what it means to be a learner. Are we, just a recipient, or are we actually, in a way, a maker? Are we being a learner is as much a person who is, making it happen, and not just as a person who is, passive and waiting for, some kind of lecture, or whatever it is. Yeah. So there is that. I would like to emphasize this idea of reciprocity, that what we are not only having a conversation with in terms of our social sort of structure, but we are also having a conversation with the environment. We're having a conversation with the trees, with the birds, or with materials. When we're working with clay, we begin a process of actually exploring the material as though it was something that we are having a conversation with. It may be not a verbal conversation, but it is a kind of a conversation which brings out a kind of a form of meaning, of expression, of form, of idea. Yeah, so that's what's interesting about materials. That we think that they are, in a way, just materials and they're inert, but in fact they teach us a lot about things. Also about how we go about imagining. Yeah, so I like that comment. That children, art gives that scope for children to actually find themselves, and to give themselves a sense of, understanding who, they are in the process of actually, a learner, in the process of actually learning. Yeah. Anything else, Priyanka?
Not as of now.
Okay.
What I had, and in fact, Roshan, would you like to throw light on how you define art in education, art in language as part of this talk, so that it could help us all contextualize a little bit?
Yes. So one of the areas that I've actually been particularly interested in, and it's sort of, I've been interested in how that sort of develops, is from, you could say, 2 to 3-year-old children, and even younger, but preschool. When you're talking about 2 to 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, when children are beginning to, you could say, orient themselves to their environment and their social context, and start developing ideas, start developing ways of thinking and understanding what this, what's going on around them. So you could say before a child actually enters into the system of education, the child has already learned huge amounts actually about what their environment is, and who's who, and maybe even to the extent of beginning to actually articulate what they feel about their environment. So for me, that's an interesting part, because it's almost a unstructured part of a child's growth, where the child is actually probably at its peak, in a certain sense of their development in terms of their ways of understanding, and the ways of them um, working out in a very complex way um, what are the sort of the elements around them, what makes an everyday, what happens. So when I started looking at this aspect of a child's growth, I started getting interested very much in how children um, from very young begin to start actually um, basically mobilizing themselves. Yeah, and the idea was, in my mind, that in the process of actually mobilizing themselves, they are actually beginning to explore the world around them. And that idea of mobility and that idea of actually changing their positions and shifting themselves, from one place to another place, or even to the extent of making sounds as they move. So we know, like from many studies, that a lot of how children are able to actually vocalize their you could say begin to sort of make sounds is actually through a certain kind of a mobility. And in the same way, I would say that a lot of children begin um, to orient themselves is also through an ability to actually look at things and point towards things. So it's not just about them moving towards an object, but it's an ability to actually identify an object and be able to direct another, person, an individual in the room to recognize what the child is actually becoming aware of, or recognize what the child is actually uh, identifying with. Yeah. So what I would like us to explore just in this brief session is an understanding of gesture. How do we understand, how do we place gesture in relation to a language development, and also how do we understand a form of babbling. Yeah, what do we mean? Does everybody kind of get this idea of a babble? Do you know what in babbling? Could somebody express themselves in a babble so that I can hear?
Ba, 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 ba.
That's kind of babble. And is there something to do with gesture that you can add to your babble? Is it possible to see, Priyanka?
Yes, absolutely. You're
If anybody would like to express themselves, like, can you do something that, is that, how do you actually, how can we start seeing that, almost the sort of the beginning of language is in a babble. Yeah, and it's a kind of expression of a body. Say,
Farzana is here.
Yeah, a baby
Farzana.
wanting to be picked up
Yeah,
puts his hands up and
that's right.
also his body,
Yeah.
that I want to be picked up.
So, do you have a recollection of any child you remember who? What would be the kind of babble that was memorable? Do you have any memory of that?
My own children.
Yeah, but do you
Yeah.
would you be able to share a kind of a babble? What was that?
um, well, my older one kept on saying "ma." Everything was "ma." So whatever he wanted
Okay,
was "ma."
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, anything would be just "ma."
That's right. Yeah.
That's his first babble that
Okay,
started.
okay.
And "agu."
It could
Don't
even
ask me
be
what
that
it meant. "Agu."
da da. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mamata
yeah.
has also said
So,
point and wave. One participant
say
has mentioned
pointing.
pointing and waving.
Yeah, yeah. Even even this idea of gripping. So a lot of children, you notice, from a very young age, seem to be almost finding something to hold on to. So there is a physical movement towards, grasping something. Yeah. So that idea of grasping something. Another thing which I found very interesting is that would anybody know why children actually take objects and put them into their mouths first? What could be the reason? Is it something to do with eating, or do you think there's some other sensory, experience that's happening that's changing the way they understand their environment? Does anybody know about this? About why children grab things and put it in their mouth?
There's a response from Nomita. Uh,
Okay.
Taste, knowing the world through taste.
Yeah. So some people have commented that it may be also to do with recognizing shape through the the cavity of your mouth. It actually you start. It's not just about what you're seeing in terms of a form, but it's almost what you put in your mouth to be able to recognize form. Yeah, so there is an argument that a lot of children are actually beginning to see things by putting it in their mouth. Yeah, that's a curious thing. It's not just about tasting things. So a lot of things are not, say, like even you see a lot of toys which are plastic, but children love the idea of putting it in their mouth. The first thing that they choose to do seems to be, wanting to put something in their mouth. So that's a curious thing.
So Purti says they want to feel, their senses are at work, they want to
Yeah.
explore the world. Farzana says maybe it's a familiar action, like being fed.
Yes. So it seems to be that it is more than just about consuming the world. It's as though you are consuming the world through an experience, and not about it being a digestive process, but it is about seeing things around you, touching things, something which is tactile, but also being able to experience it in an internal, sort of like you are actually understanding form in the way in which you feel it within your mouth. So that's the curious thing. Anyway, that's an interesting understanding of why children actually choose to grab something and put it straight in their mouth. Yeah, you'd think, okay, maybe they're hungry, but typically it's actually more than them just wanting to eat it. It's something also about seeing the shape of things. Yeah, which is not about how your eyes are seeing it, but it's about how you feel it through your mouth. There's a tactile experience that's going on there. Okay. Um, the other thing was about gesturing. Does anybody sort of have a thought about gesturing? So what I wanted to ask people to do is, could we spend some time um, creating shapes in the air? So it's called, you could say, like it's drawing in the air, yeah, and thinking about when it actually is a form and when is it actually a gesture. What do we mean by a gesture as something which is different from, for example, drawing a picture. Yeah. So when, even if I were to use my whole hand, yeah, and I were to say, okay, it's both drawing, but it could also be shaping something. It could be about imagining that I am lifting something. It could be something about me pointing towards something, but it also could be something towards a way of bringing out a form which is not about a thing or an object, but it is a way of expressing myself in some way. So when I do this, is it a shape that I'm creating, or is it something to do with how I am trying to find um, a means of expressing myself? It may not be as literal as pointing something. So when we're saying a gesture, one thing is, hello, or one thing is namaste, or one thing is, what to do. Those are kind of gestures. But are there other forms that we are aware of that we do almost, spontaneously, but in themselves they actually become quite interesting, um, you could say, like illustrations of how we feel about things. Yeah, so gestures themselves are actually quite vital from a very young age towards a form of expression. That's what I'm, yeah, sort of,
The
that's
question
what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
that conscious and subconscious or natural gestures.
Yes. So that would be an interesting thing. One of the things which I thought is that if you were to do a gesture in your right hand, could you then try and do the same gesture in the left hand? Yeah. So if I were to say, like, if I were to say, like, can we take it easy? How would that expression change if I were to say, if I were to do it on my with my left hand? So what is actually going on between my right hand, and how is it actually translating, or what are the interpretations that I'm finding between my right and my left hand? So is it that there are certain gestures which are almost subconsciously, that I do, um, and if I were to then, you know, find a kind of a similarity of that same gesture in a hand that I would not use otherwise. So another thing is, I wanted to ask, could you do that with the same gesture with your leg, for example? How does that movement between your hand, yeah, what could be a gesture? You could say, can you do, if you were to do this, yeah, as a kind of a gesture, yeah, or you were to do this as a gesture, yeah, is this a gesture? What would be the kind of positions that you would find that you could alternate those gestures in other, you know, parts of your body? So if I were to say, if I were to use my elbow as the only for means of, my gesturing, what would that be? Yeah, could I draw could I start kind of pointing at things with my elbow rather than my finger? Yeah, can I start thinking about, or could I start gesturing with my shoulder? Yeah, what changes are actually happening between my elbow as a pointer to things around me, and if I were to use my shoulder as a pointer to things around me? Yeah, what's happening in that way? Or what if I were to use my head as a form of gesturing? Is it only to do with my hands, or is it actually to do with how my body starts moving about, that points to maybe different things that are I am attentive about, things that I am aware about. Yeah. So subconsciously, there could be lots of things that I'm aware about. There's a certain kind of a body consciousness, you could say. And that seems to be the beginning of me finding expression in my body, like, which is not necessarily a verbal expression, but it is actually an ability to see that my body itself becomes a form. You could say dance is a classic example, that it, by me making myself move, enables me to start seeing that there are things that are around me that I can find a connection with. Yeah, so dancing itself becomes, you could say, a dialogue in space of one's, environment and one's context. Yeah, so that idea that actually your movement is enabling you to find connections with your environment, and there is a certain reciprocity that is happening between you pointing at something and then you expecting a response, in relation to actually pointing towards something. Yeah, there is some contact that you have made by suggesting, you know a movement towards that object. Yeah. Okay, so is there anybody who would like to just reflect a little bit about this in their experiences? Is this something that you have observed as actually being foundational to, you could say, a development in our communication system? So when we're talking about language, where do we begin? Is it, when we go to school and we start learning A, B, C, D, or when we start learning, A, E, or, you start learning the alphabets? Or are we talking about a language system that is innate in the way in which our body responds to the world around us, and it begins to find context as something which is processing the reality, processing the idea of what is around me into something which then becomes formalized into what we're calling as, whatever, vowels and words and, sentence construction and, prose or whatever it is. Yeah. So where does this idea of language come from? That would be one of the kind of things that, I was wanting to maybe, like, if we could, through this discussion, find maybe different, maybe like points of interest, where, what is it that is actually catching your, capturing your imagination to start seeing that, there is a certain kind of emergence of what we call as literacy. Yeah. Any response?
Yes. So there's an
To that?
statement. Kekul, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Will a child who has less opportunity to observe adults during developmental phase be more experimental and creative, since he is not limited to what he has seen? Should I repeat that question?
Okay. So there is an understanding that, yeah, is that correct? Yeah. So there is a curious phenomenon which is to do with how we find that a lot of children are actually, there is a lot of mimicking an adult. So what we are actually also understanding about, say, even whether it is gesture or even movement, is the child's ability to actually see an adult behave in a certain way. So that's how we have ideas about, say, like how cultural, the child's development is also affected by its cultural context, yeah, and its social context. So the child is not just a developing, biological, being, but the child is also a social body. It's a body that is actually developing within a certain kind of a cultural context. And that idea that a child is also you could say, mimicking and finding um, uh, ways of articulating themselves through copying, their, especially in a family context, the way in which your mother or your father or your grandmother would be communicating with you would, in a sense, form the beginning of your own way of articulating what you're feeling about, things around you. So I would suggest that creativity is also something to do with the ability to play with, the adult world. So even whether it is in terms of, say, like dolls, for example, it's very much encouraged by the adult. Typically an adult would actually give a child, as a gift, a maybe a, like, a doll or a bear or even something to play with. Yeah, and that could be very cultural. And then that becomes a way in which the child is actually enabled to explore their, creative, you could say, like, world. Their imagination is, um, in a way, prompted by, I would even go to the extent of saying how the space is created around its home, the child's home, or how the child responds to the scale of things, changes their way of imagining what things are in context and what things are not, maybe, do not even exist. So I don't know if I'm answering that question rightly, but I feel creativity is very much also to do with the real objects, the concrete objects which are around, the child's environment. It's not Creativity is not an abstract phenomenon. It is very much in relation to the child's, context. Yeah, I'm ready to, have a further sort of, like, if I'm being able to articulate myself in maybe what I am understanding as imaginary, as the imaginary world, is very much in relation to what I think about, in what I think about things, in a real sense. So the imagination is not separate from the real world. That's what I would say. I would like some more, any thoughts about this idea of what it means. What if you are to put yourself in a child's, you could say, like a mind. What would you imagine as being imaginative? Like, what would you think that the child? What is it that is actually creative in a child's mind that makes you think about creativity yourself? That would be the kind of question that I would ask.
Hi. So
Yes.
thank you for allowing me to speak. This
Yes.
is kind of extension of what we were discussing. So actually, my question was, like, a lot of times when we try to see the difference between the artist and the painter, that it's a thin line of imagination which differentiates between two. So, and then a lot of times when you give certain design exercises to children, now
Yeah.
children who are exposed to Google and everything, it's very difficult for them to come out of what they have already seen and create something original, whereas
Yeah.
children who are probably underprivileged and are not exposed to a lot of things that they've already seen seem to be more creative and experimental in nature. So
Okay.
is knowing a lot more, or exposing your children to a lot of things at that early age, is it a good thing, or how do we balance that? That's something that I'm still struggling to figure out.
I think that's a very key, like a point that you're making. That when you find that, especially children who are coming from, like, I would say, educated, privileged, privileged in the sense that they have, opportunities to, explore the world in, their own sort of free time and things like that. Often turn out to be more conditioned and more limited than a child who you would otherwise think doesn't have the opportunities or doesn't have the kind of, scope to be creative. So it turns out that what maybe we are actually having to deal with as educators is to see that a lot of what seems to be blocking the child's creativity is the conditions that we set around what it means to be creative. And that can go to the extent of it being that, telling a child that, that doesn't look, that doesn't look like a tree, or that doesn't look like, that the child is actually being judged by what is right and what is wrong, in the way in which the adult is actually thinking about the child. The, not just about the child, but the development of the child's, maybe even way of understanding the world. So does that make sense? So often what we are actually dealing with is in terms of our preset idea of what it means to be right or wrong. I would almost like have the problem in the zone, as it were, in our judgment of child's creativity, and how we set up a certain kind of a standard for the child to be creative or not, depending on how we imagine the child ought to be. I don't know if that sort of answers a little bit of what you're suggesting, but I think it is very important. What you're saying is, why is it that we find that certain children are more creative in limited resources, and how is it that children who've been given all the resources that they want turn out to be very, sort of almost quite unimaginative. So, there's a kind of a contradiction there. How is that possible? Does it make sense?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the
Yeah.
discussion. Thank you.
So the condition, this is what Ken Robinson talks about in his lecture, is that a lot of what we do in education, or in schools especially, is actually limit the child in terms of their creativity, and we should actually be more open to what the child thinks rather than what we think the child ought to think. I think that's the difference. That seems to be the problem. Yeah, something else?
So Roshan, it's 5:40. Would you like me to share
Yes.
the document and contextualize this in language? We can have.
Yes, that's the thing. Did anybody get to look at the other growth of the child through art? Were you able to? Did anybody look through that? Did you find anything interesting in that? The write-up of pattern making, of the development of writing in early childhood, and its relationship to how children actually begin a process of almost structuring a system of sort of like what we're calling as of images that we then understand as a word. So the word, in a sense, in a actual sense, is an image. A letter is an image. If you were to think that when we look at letters in themselves and we look at the alphabets, they're actually formation of images in the child's mind, as much as it is in the adult's mind. And what we seem to be understanding as literacy is as much a system of coding in terms of the comprehension of what the words mean, as much as it is about recognizing the words themselves in their visual formation. Yeah, so that seems to be also quite a challenge. What is the relation between the written word, as in what you see, and what is actually written. What is the comprehension in relation to what is the recognition of the word itself? How do you read and how do you comprehend? What is the relation between reading and comprehension? Yeah, that seems to have been one of the things.
A couple of messages coming in.
Yeah.
Namita says, yes, many ideas, poetry, stories, etc. Very interesting ideas on art and presentation. Rhythm says, yes, it was very interesting. We speak about, when we speak about emergent literacy, I like the part about,
Yes.
I liked the part about creating stories through drawings and making books in the classroom and writing them.
So drawing can both mean picture making, but say you could, one of the activities that we've explored in early childhood, sort of, writing, is for a child to actually just write whatever they, write, like without actually saying, this doesn't look like a letter, or this doesn't look like a word, or this doesn't make sense in terms of, sentence construction. Just allow children to scribble. Yeah, so the idea of doodling. So, and then if you were to actually ask the child, okay, you've drawn a picture and you've written something about it. Can you tell us, what it means? Or not what it means, but tell us what you have written. Yeah, so it's quite an interesting thing for you to then maybe like write down what the child is saying, and then make a comparison between what you have written as an adult who, has a certain kind of a training in terms of writing, the way in which we recognize as the written word, and what the child is actually, you could say, beginning to shape and form a way of visualizing what they think. Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of writing could in itself be a formation. Yes.
Actually, in context to this, like a varied interpretation, Nomita says very interesting ideas. Even the varied interpretations on a story is clear to see. The impact of a story on children is very different, similar to what you're saying, that how they interpret in different ways. Each child,
That could be, yeah. See.
Each child hooks onto very different elements, makes for a good starter for rich classroom discussions.
So this could be as much as picture making, in the way that we are actually saying, a picture doesn't look like a tree, or doesn't look like a mountain, or doesn't look like a person. Could we do the same with writing? Could we, just ask children to scribble and to begin a process of actually movement? Yeah, and that's what I'm calling as a gesture. And not only with your right hand, but what if you were to ask a child to write with their left hand? What if you were to ask a child to write from top down, from left to right to left, from bottom end to top end diagonally? So can writing actually be something which is more than just this idea of writing A, B, C, D, for example? Yeah, can we actually start creating a kind of a situation, a scenario for a child to see that writing is actually fun. There's an element of being able to articulate yourself without having to be conditioned by a very strict kind of, I would say, rigid form of writing. Can we make it more creative in the sense? And then, of course, we have to develop that, and we have to sort of, inquire, and I would suggest have a dialogue with children to better understand what is it that the child is actually trying to express, before saying you're talking nonsense, for example. That's typically the case when a child is babbling. The idea is to tell the child to shut up, because there's enough of that. Like, we don't want you to babble. But similarly, if a child were to doodle or a child were to scribble, could we allow the child to say what they want to say in whichever form they choose to do, before making a judgment and telling the child, that you've got it completely wrong. Like, you just don't know how to read and write.
Okay, Roshan, we have 10 minutes left.
So that's something which is quite an. Yeah.
We have 10 minutes left. Shall I share the screen with the document?
Yes, please. I would like to talk particularly about J. Swaminathan's book, his book, which he titled Magical Script. Yeah. So if people are able to look at that, so there's, can we go to page 3? Yeah. So there, this is a very interesting case study, in fact, where there were people from the Korwa community in Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh who gave an appeal over land rights to officials to be handed over to the government. And his letter consisted of random markings by he, but he imagined that his thoughts and words could be read. So the interest was for the officials to actually um, interpret what was really written, by the Korwa leader. What was it that they were actually trying to articulate? So it wasn't maybe so much of a problem about whether they had written, something which was nonsense, or whether they were, able to read and write. But the point made was that there was an attempt to actually articulate a thought, and it was revealing how important, more than ever, communities who are, traditionally maybe not having a script, start maybe choosing to document and to record forms of what we would call as, a script, to be able to define what's going on in their mind. That's just one case study that was, to illustrate this idea of how critical the script has actually become in modern society. Yeah. Could you like to go some more, Priyanka? Yeah, there's this idea of movement and literacy. Yeah, so this is also something that we talked about. You can go to the next, ideas and feelings expressed. So um, this idea that the body is something that we are actually responding to. Before, we seem to be thinking about, how to communicate and express ourselves in through our voice. um, a lot of actually what we express ourselves through is our body, the movement of our body, the gestures, and how that, as you can see in this picture, is then explored. You could say beyond, bounds, by, taking, you could say, like, objects. So typically a child could actually, if you were to encourage a child to use, maybe, like, a floor mop, yeah, and find that, how is it that they can walk through a space. So I don't know if you remember, especially, I remember in my childhood, just thoroughly enjoying taking a stick and, trailing that, stick on the ground, and just, taking almost this stick for a walk. Yeah, but being very pleased that I was leaving a trace. So that's another idea of Paul Klee. If you go further down, he talks about this idea of taking a line for a walk. If you go one step further down, yeah, combining different drawing actions, note the closed shape and the idea of, yeah, these are just examples. Further down, if you can go, Priyanka.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is Paul Klee. So he develops this idea that a line, you can actually take a line for a walk. I don't know if anybody have actually read Paul Klee's book, The Pedagogical Sketchbook. And he very much discusses this idea that lines in themselves have journeys that we trail along with. So if you were to follow a line, it has its own journey, and it has its own story to tell. And in a way, that you could say is the beginning of both writing but also drawing. So, by taking a line for a walk, you're actually beginning to imagine. Yeah, the line becomes a way of imagining. And again, Paul Klee talks about movement as the basis of all becoming, and then how Yeah, this is some of his pictures. So this is very much, you can say, is a kind of an emergent, visualization of things, especially in children. The action of doing, scratching or doodling or scribbling is very much an action which is actually explorative, and it is, a process of actually, you could say, embodying, and I would say becoming a part of, what seems to be emerging in an image. Yeah. So Priyanka, if you go to the next image, there's a lot of discussion even about how, when we look at a lot of rock painting, that typically, the forms, I don't know if, I'm sure many of you have seen Bimbedkar, for example, that a lot of the forms have actually emerged out of the rock. There is even one in Hampi, if you know, and it looks like, that a kind of a serpent is coming out of a cave, and it's known in many painting, like rock painting, side like examples, that the images are almost actually coming out of the rock. Yeah. So it's not an idea of imposing an image onto the rock. It's actually almost tracing. You could almost say it's a way of extracting an image out of, the material. Yeah. So that's quite an interesting development. If we were to allow children, I would say, like to play with image to the point where the child starts seeing how an image is actually evolving and how an image is actually emerging, then I think there's a lot more scope for the child to actually become, that much more imaginative than being told, that, like if you were to tell a child, hey, draw a tree or draw a house, or, tell me what you're going to draw, and then I'll, give you a pen and paper or something like that. So can we, have, can we give more space and, time for child to play with the idea that images are not something which are preset, but images are something to do with an emergent, formation of multiple things, of how the materials are themselves behaving, how the body is actually moving, how the mind is actually changing the way we think about what an image is. Yeah, let's see if we can go further. One, is that the end? That's the last.
So, so I think that's all the time we have for today. Roshan, thank you so much for
Thank you.
this session. Thank you all for joining us. We have a Facebook page called Riyadh Foundation. We'd like you to follow the page so that you are constantly updated on upcoming events. And there's a YouTube channel of ours as well, where we upload all event videos as well. Just in case you have missed out on anything, you can always go there and refer to the highlights of the video. And Roshan, many people have messaged thanking you for the provoking session. And yes, thank you for your time. It was lovely. Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.